So, echoing what Jane said, it's such a pleasure to have you here tonight with us, Dr. Narango. Thank you for joining us on a Thursday evening. Dr. Narango, for those who do not know, is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a 2020 recipient of the David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellowship. Her research interests include urban suburban ecology, plant-animal interactions, and community-driven science, just to name a few. And Dr. Narango has a PhD in entomology and wildlife ecology from the University of Delaware, a master's in natural resource ecology from the Ohio State University, and a bachelor's in environmental biology from State University in New York, and over 15 years of experience studying wildlife. She is also an avid birder and gardener who really enjoys getting others excited about the natural world in their own yards, which is why we have invited her here tonight. So thank you again. And I will give it to you to share your screen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can you see my screen? Can you confirm for me? Okay, awesome.
Yes.
So thank you so much for that introduction and for this invitation. It's always a pleasure to get the opportunity to share my work virtually. So that I, don't have to have any carbon footprint. I get to be comfortable in my own home. I get to have my tea, so it's great. I really appreciate the invitation. And I'm also really excited to share with you some of my work from the last, like 8 years or so of my life, where I've been really trying to understand the extent that plant identity matters for wildlife conservation, and really to understand how we as the public can participate in conservation through the way that we manage plants in our gardens. So before I give talks, I like to kind of just introduce myself and say like who I am as a scientist. So I like to call myself an interaction ecologist, not an ornithologist or an entomologist. I study interaction ecology, because I study interactions between plants and animals, how they interact with their environments, and then also how they interact with people who are the major drivers of environmental change. And I work primarily in managed human-dominated systems like residential yards, urban forests. I also have a little bit of work in shade coffee in Central and South America. And most of my work so far has really focused heavily on the relationships between plants, insects, and then the insectivorous birds that eat them. And like I said, I work in these human-dominated landscapes, which, if you think about it, is basically everywhere. We have dramatically transformed the world to support a growing human population. And with that development comes cascading effects on habitat quality for wildlife. But we're also facing drastic losses of biodiversity, extinction of nature experiences in every generation. And so our grand challenge as conservationists, as members of the global public, is to really understand how can we then share the world with biodiversity, but also simultaneously support people and also inspire them to care as well. And that's been a real, driving force of my research for many years. And, as an ecologist, I would really argue that we can't have successful conservation right now in the Anthropocene, is what we call it, the time that's dominated by people. We can't have successful conservation unless we incorporate privately managed land. Because currently in the United States, more than 60% of it is considered privately owned. And there's some estimates that for the contiguous United States, 10 to 15% of that land is considered residential areas alone. But this, these residential areas in particular are a real conservation challenge for managers and ecologists, because the decisions that are made on this private land is made through the individual decisions of parcel owners based on their own needs and values. And so if we want to really restore this privately managed land for biodiversity, we need to understand, we need to study these areas, and we need to understand quantitatively what can we suggest that would actually improve these urban, these suburban areas as habitat for wildlife, so that we can make real recommendations for people on what to do. And there are a lot of really optimistic stories about urban and residential yard conservation, from new species of leopard frogs that were found in New York City. We have endangered rusty-patched bumblebees that are found in Missouri and Wisconsin. We have the story of the Atala butterfly, which was thought to be extinct and then came back in people's residential yards after they started planting the species that this particular butterfly uses. I just found out about this cute little mammal in the middle here is this endangered marsupial in Australia that will use residential yards, and the individuals that use these yards will use them exclusively. They have no need to go to natural habitat because they're finding everything that they need in these residential areas. And even in some of the work that I've done studying bird communities across the United States, we were finding in some areas of Boston that residential yards were supporting wood thrush, which is a species of tremendous conservation concern, and also has declining populations. So there are birds that are using these areas. So we need to understand, are they doing well? And what is it about these areas that these animals are using that makes them fit as habitat? And so a lot of the work that I focus on is really on the plant communities. And the reason for that is that one of the primary ways that people can manage their land is through the plants that they cultivate, from which trees that the developer chose to leave behind and which ones that they cut down, the way that we mow our lawns, the designer gardens that we create, the shrubs and the flowers that we plant. Each one of those seemingly small decisions has had the real additive effect of completely transforming the structure and the composition of the plants that have survived to occupy the present day. And we really have surprisingly little information on what that means for wildlife. And so in the first part of my talk here, I'm really going to talk about why plant identity might matter, but from an insect perspective. So for those of you that are really the bird-driven folks, just hang on in there. We're going to talk about bugs for a second. And many of you might be familiar with the monarch butterfly, who as a caterpillar will feed exclusively on milkweed. But what many folks don't realize, and I didn't know this until I started my PhD, is that more than 90% of our plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. And that's because these insects, like moths and butterflies, have adapted over evolutionary time to feed on very specific host plants, for which they've overcome those nasty chemical compounds that are found in the leaf. They also adapt to the timing of that plant, to the shape and size of that plant. So one really great example that I like to share is this. This is a double-toothed prominent. It's a very cool looking caterpillar that shares the double-toothed shape when it's a caterpillar with the double-toothed elm leaf, of which is the only genus of plant that this caterpillar can eat. And then it turns into this moth that, some would say is kind of drab, but I think it's beautiful in its own, special way. And there's lots of examples of plant specialization. So I'm just going to share a few species that I like. So here, first we have the juniper hairstreak. It's a gorgeous green butterfly. And in order to get the juniper hairstreak, when it's a caterpillar, which is when it spends most of its life in this larval form feeding on plants, it feeds exclusively of plants from the genus Juniperus. So red cedars basically is the only plant that this butterfly can use. So if you want to have a sustainable population of juniper hair streaks, you need to have red cedars. And then when they pupate and they turn into the butterfly, then you can go ahead and plant some mountain mint, which is a small flowered nectaring flower that the adults will like to visit. So if you have both of these components in your garden, you can really create good habitat to attract the juniper hair streak. And the convenient thing about insects, or, entomologists do this really convenient thing where they name the plant species, or they name the butterfly species after the plant that it uses. So that's the reason it's called a juniper hair streak. It feeds on junipers. This is a butterfly that many of you may have seen before. It can be pretty common in the eastern United States. It's called the eastern tiger swallowtail. And this is an example of a species that can use many different kinds of plants, but then they locally specialize. So right now I'm in Massachusetts, and up here, our eastern tiger swallowtails will use mostly cherry. That's their primary host plant. And as you get further south, they use things like tulip tree and ashes. And as you get even further south into the real southeastern part of the United States, where you have these semi-evergreen deciduous plants, then this butterfly will start to feed on sweet bay magnolia whenever they can. That's the real plant that they like to have. So you can see that even though this butterfly across the country can feed on lots of plants, at a local scale, they need very specific types of plants. Here's another one that I just really like. This one is called the Snowberry hummingbird moth. And gardeners really this is like the only moth that gardeners get a kick out of, because it'll come just so readily to your phlox flowers to nectar. And people think it's a hummingbird, so they get excited and they're like, oh wait, it's an insect, what's going on here? But really, to support these hummingbird moths, which are super cool, you need not just the phlox, you also need some of their host plants, which are things like dogbane, native honeysuckle, and of course snowberry, which is in their name. And then finally, my last example, and I just throw this in because I like this moth so much. This is the rosy maple moth. I'm sorry, I didn't look it up to see if this is in Louisiana, but everybody's got to know about this cool moth because it's just so beautiful. To see this kind of pink in nature is just incredible. And this is a moth that uses mostly maples, but here in Massachusetts, where they're very, very common, they absolutely love sugar maple. So if they have a choice over all the other maples that are in that genus, they will choose sugar maple, and they'll really hone in on that plant because that one has the best nutrition that they're best adapted to use. And if you're wondering, if you're not into moths and you're thinking, oh, Desiree, you just chose a bunch of really gaudy moths. They don't all look like that, but I can assure you these are not anomalies. Moths are amazing. They're beautiful and incredible, and they're very important pollinators in their own right. So when people say pollinators, they think of butterflies, they think of bees, but our moths are just as important and can be really fun. You know, mothing is the new birding, FYI. So I took pictures of most of these right in my yard. So they're a really fun thing. But in order to get these beautiful charismatic moths, you need to support the caterpillars. So you need to have the host plants that these caterpillars feed on. So it turns out that when you look to see how many caterpillars are found on different kinds of plants, are they distributed evenly among all the plants that are in a region? And it turns out that they're not. And this is some work recently published that I've been working on this for the last couple of years. We've compiled a database of plant caterpillar interactions from across the United States, from 25 different states. And so we can look at each state and we can see what plants are supporting most of the diversity that's out there. So I pulled out Louisiana. And if you didn't know, in Louisiana, you have over 2,147 different species of moths and butterflies. So these are lepidopterans. And the plant that supports the most of your caterpillars are oaks at 364, cherries at 220 species, hickories at 177. Those are really the power player woody trees and shrubs that are supporting most of the diversity. And then here, the first 5 are these woody trees. The next 5 are herbaceous plants. So among flowering plants, like the things that you would plant in your garden, they just tend to support lower diversity than trees and shrubs, but they're valuable in their own right. And so these are the top 5 in our herbaceous plants. We have clover, goldenrod, wonderful nectaring plant in the fall for bees and butterflies, but also supports the larval caterpillars. So really a just power player plant. Aster, sunflower, and nightshade. And these are all specific numbers for Louisiana. And it turns out that when you look across, oh wait, I'm sorry. So here, there's plants that support a lot of caterpillars. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have a whole slew of non-native plants, as well as native plants that support very few caterpillar species. So these are some popular things that I know that people like to have in their gardens, and you can see it's vastly different. So for I can't say it. Ginkgos at 4, bamboo at 1, Japanese elm at 0, lilac 0. So at least for Louisiana, there's no caterpillars that are known to use these non-native plants. And then the same is true for herbaceous plants. So we have marigolds at 7, cosmos at 4, daffodils. These are all things that you can easily pick up at Home Depot. Unfortunately, these are not supporting very many of these ecological interactions. And every time that I give this talk, I try to pull out numbers for whoever my audience is. And so I have to, tweak the numbers a little bit. And for Louisiana, I actually was like, dang, marigold supports 7 caterpillars. For like every other state, it's 0. So there is variation depending on where you go in the country, but really, especially for these non-native plants, it does not vary a lot. It's never going to get to the same amount of diversity that something like a goldenrod is supporting. And it turns out that when you look across the United States, there are plants that are disproportionately important no matter where you go. So this is the percent caterpillar species across all of the 25 states that we had in the data set. And you can see it's the same plants. They just come up again and again as being important: oaks, willows, cherries. And so in this paper, we really put forward this notion that these are keystone plants, that while diversity, of course, is always important if we want to support habitat and ecological interactions, it's always good to have more species of plants. But really, we also need to prioritize some of these keystone species that are doing the lion's share of supporting ecological interactions, at least from a plant caterpillar's perspective. But there's the possibility that these plants could also be important for other things, such as birds and other insects. And if you're wondering, are there other insects that are plant specialists? Absolutely, definitely. Some flower flies are great pollinators. They prefer certain flowers over others. Beetles will feed on different plants when they're in their larval stage. And something that I got really excited about when I learned is that our bees can also be pollen specialists. But I'm a data scientist, or I'm an ecologist. I need data, right? So I had to look up the numbers for this. So this is for the Eastern United States. More than 30% of our native bees are considered pollen specialists. So they feed on just one family or one genus of plant to collect that pollen and feed it to their young. And in bees, it's much more specialized. So most of the flowers support one species of bee here. Another flower will support one species of bee. They've adapted with one another. So things like the fragile dogwood bee only eats dogwood pollen. So you can't have the dogwood bee unless you have the dogwood plant. But there are some plants that did pop up as supporting a fair number of bee species that might be ones that, that you'd want to consider. So here are willows again. So they're good for caterpillars, but now they're also good for bees. So here's another super plant, dogwoods at 4 species, and then sunflowers, goldenrods, blueberries, and asters. Those all popped up as being important for caterpillars. Now here they are again as being really important for bees. So just great plants to have if you want to support insect diversity. So some of you might be wondering right now, Desiree, why are you talking about insects? This is an Audubon Society meeting and I don't care about bugs. I care about birds. And so now I want to talk to you a little bit about why plant identity might matter from the bird's perspective. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Birds eat insects. They're incredibly important for supporting our bird populations. But again, here's some data for you today. Across the world, so this is a global data set. If we look at songbirds, so passerines, 95% of them eat invertebrates. At least 10% of their diet is invertebrates. 71% eat more than 50% invertebrates. So these are insects, but also other arthropods like spiders and mites and all kinds of different critters. And in the United States, in an interaction data set, I found that 440 bird species eat insects at least in some point in the annual cycle. And the reason for that is that insects are highly nutritious for growing young, or they're highly nutritious in general, but that's especially important when you're growing baby birds in the nest. And we see again and again that caterpillars in particular turn out to be highly preferred by our insectivorous birds. And the reason is because they're just a power pack, you know, little group of food here. They got high protein, which is great for growing bones and making feathers. They have high calories, which makes them really efficient. So you don't have to go back as much to get food. You can just bring back a big juicy caterpillar to your nest. And they also have really high carotenoids that they get from those plant leaves that they're eating. And those carotenoids are really important for immune function. They're also really important for making beautiful plumage. So the reason that our cardinals are beautiful red is because of the carotenoids that they get from their food. And so in this way, our bird conservation is really intimately connected to insect conservation. And our insect conservation is then built on the foundation of the plant communities that we cultivate on managed land. And so those seemingly small decisions that I talked about before, like where to plant a tree and what kind, can have really far-reaching implications for food webs. But this is where we're really lacking data, and that's where my research is trying to tackle this in a real mechanistic way. And, you know, I like studying birds. I love them. I would do it just for fun. But birds are a really great indicator in general. And I love this quote by Tom Lovejoy that says, if you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. Because if we support our bird populations, we're going to support all the things that those birds need to survive. And we're going to have healthier ecosystems. So we can really use birds as this indicator to help evaluate our restoration progress. So the next part of the talk here, I just want to talk a little bit more specifically about some of my work, looking at one of the questions that a householder might be asking themselves if they're landscaping in their garden. Do I plant native plants, or do I plant non-evolutionary non-native plants? They're evolutionary novel non-native plants is what I'm trying to say. And historically, most plant choices were made based on how pretty a plant is or how easy it is to maintain, but there's increasing interest in prioritizing plants that support ecosystem services or gifts, and also supporting local biodiversity. And really, this isn't a trivial question because horticulture is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Non-native plants are incredibly popular. And if you go into urban areas, most of the plant diversity that you find is dominated by non-native plants. And so in order to improve these areas for biodiversity, we really need to ask whether they're serving the same ecological function as native species. But another way that I've been kind of thinking about this question is not just native and non-native, but to really understand how can we strategically landscape with productive plants that can improve wildlife habitat. So not just saying, you know, yes, you can plant them or no, you can't, but trying to understand, is there a threshold? Is there an amount that's okay? What should we be striving for to create habitat? So to get at this question of, you know, are non-native plants the ecological equivalent, entomologists have been looking at this question for a while. And, you know, what they find is that non-native plants, they haven't evolved with our insect communities. So they tend to support lower diversity, fewer of our most specialized plant-eating insects, which makes sense based on, you know, what I shared with you before. And so what these entomologists had said that if these non-native plants don't support the insect diversity, then this could have cascading impacts on insectivorous birds because they rely on them for food. But it turned out that before I started working on my PhD, that this question actually hadn't been asked. It was just an assumption that entomologists were making that native plants were better for birds, particularly in these urban and suburban managed systems. And so I was really fortunate that when I started working on this question, I got to collaborate with two really awesome scientists, Doug Tallamy, who's at University of Delaware, who's an entomologist, and also Pete Mara, who's at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, who is an ornithologist. And so I came in with my plant nerdiness and also a little bit of, you know, my background in birds. I had been studying them for many years, and a newfound enthusiasm for insect diversity. And we asked this question of how do non-native plants affect these trophic linkages or these food web linkages between plants, insects, and birds. And we did this within a program called Neighborhood Nest Watch, which is a community science program through the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, where we are actually studying the urban ecology of birds in Washington, D.C. But we're also, in addition to collecting data, we also invite the householders to join us in our data collection so they can learn about the ecology of their yards, they can learn about birds, they can learn about the process of science itself. And so it's a really unique, you know, fun opportunity to really get at some questions that are very difficult to study on private lands. And we couldn't have done it without the help of the people in this program. And so for this work, most of my work, I focused on the Carolina chickadee, which is a resident cavity nesting species. And they are, you know, kind of perfect for this study because, you know, any of you, you've probably seen a chickadee in your local forest or in your backyard. They'll readily use urban and suburban areas. They use nest boxes, so they're really easy to study. We can set a nest box up and we can attract the birds to nest. And then they're primarily insectivorous. So more than 90% of their diet are arthropods like caterpillars and spiders and leafhoppers and things like that. But they're also very charismatic and well recognized. And so it was very, very easy to get people really excited about this project and allow us into their yards to collect data. And this is just a map of, by the end of the study, we had over 200 different householders as well as their neighbors that had joined us in this project, which was just really incredible. And so in each one of these locations, we set up these nest boxes. This is a PVC nest box that you can make out of you know, just materials that you can get at Home Depot. And actually at the end, I'll have my website. You can go on my website. You can get directions if you'd like to make them. You can make them prettier than what I did. but chickadees really like them. And so we set them up in the yards, and we asked our participants to monitor those nest boxes for breeding activity. And that was just really fantastic, because then that freed up our time to then collect lots of other different data. Most importantly, we could collect caterpillar and plant data. We could follow the birds around. We could collect samples. We could do experiments, all kinds of things. It really was just incredibly beneficial to have that help, because I could have never monitored that many nest boxes over that wide of an area. And of course, you know, we realize that a bird isn't restrained by one central yard. They can go, you know, anywhere. So we actually monitored a 50-meter radius area around that nest box, so that we can make sure that the birds weren't just like nesting in the neighbor's yard or in a tree or something like that. We wanted to make sure that we knew that those birds weren't nesting there. And so what we find, we would find some really interesting nests in some really crazy places. So this is one of my favorite birds. They nested in this newspaper slot, a horizontal newspaper slot, for 3 years in a row. 3 years in a row, this bird nested in this newspaper slot, and they were successful every year. So it really goes to show that if the food is there, if the habitat is there, these birds will find a way. You know, they will find a place to put a nest. This is the part of the talk where I really define what I mean by native and non-native. And for the purposes of this study, we considered something to be native if it had a distribution that included the eastern United States. And so that might be a looser definition than some people use. It may be a stricter definition than what some people use. But it's always very important to define what your mode of inference is. So if a plant came from another country or another state, we consider that non-native. And in everything that we're studying, we're not interested in how many species or how many numbers of trees. We're really interested in the foliage volume of non-native plants and how much those plants are dominating the plants that are available for these chickadees. And so, you know, what did these sites look like? Were they in the middle of downtown DC, you know, right by the Capitol building, surrounded by pavement? No, that's not what these sites look like at all. Were they covered in nasty invasive plants that were just choking everything out and just completely homogenizing the area? No, that's not what these sites look like at all. These sites look like everyday residential houses that you went to. None of them were specifically managed for native plants. They were just mostly single family homes where every plant was chosen based on what the developer wanted or what the homeowner wanted, and what they decided to garden with. And it really was just the inherent variation that's in the Washington, D.C. area. And, you know, the great thing is that there was a lot of variation. And what we found by the end of the study is that they varied from less than 1% non-native plant biomass up to 99%. So there's a lot of differences depending on what, you know, neighborhood that you go to. It can vary quite a lot. And so, you know, one of the questions that we asked ourselves was really, do these native plants provide more food and foraging opportunities for these chickadees? And so when we look at the number of caterpillars that we found on these different native and non-native plants, we found it was pretty clear that native plants support more numbers of caterpillars as well as a higher biomass of caterpillars. And I've done some more studies since this, and we find this relationship in other insects and arthropods as well. So they support more spiders, they support more ants, they support more of most insects, except for a lot of those horticultural pests, like scale insects and aphids, that people don't want on their plants anyway. So we were getting more of those on the non-natives, but all of these important insects for birds to eat, we were finding on the native plants. So that means that the differences that the entomologists were finding were translating into a metric that's actually meaningful for birds, which is the amount of food that's available. You know, I care about plant identity. And so there was a lot of variation between plants. And so it turns out that when we plug the number of caterpillar species that are known to use a plant based on those numbers that I shared with you earlier, so we pulled out the numbers for the DC area, we see that that's actually a really great predictor for how many caterpillars we would find out in the field. So if a plant supports many caterpillar species, they also support many caterpillars. So species diversity can be a nice metric for food availability. And you might be wondering, and the same was true for both native and non-native plants. It's just that the relationship, the number of caterpillars that we found on the non-natives was lower. And so you might be wondering right now, well, what kind of non-native plant supports up to 500 different species of caterpillar? And the answer to that are the congeneric species, or the species that are related to our native species, but are from other countries. So an example of this is our native tree is the red maple, which is very, very common in urban systems. And then the non-native relative of that plant is Norway maple, which is an invasive plant and also a street tree plant. And so even though Norway maple should hypothetically support the same insect communities as the red maple, we find that on average, they're supporting about 40% fewer caterpillars and about 50% fewer species. So they're really just not the ecological equivalent at all. And then, so that's great. The native plants are supporting more food, but do the birds actually realize that? Can they actually, are they responding to that food? And so to answer this question of whether the chickadees prefer native plants, we really just let the birds tell us what trees that they like. And so we used color banding, which is a method of putting plastic bands on. We capture the birds. We're using very safe, certified methods. We put plastic bands on their legs. And so now we're able to see this bird out with our binoculars, and we can identify who that is, what nest they belong to, how long they lived, and then see what kind of trees that they're choosing. So this was one of my favorite birds. This is blue over yellow aluminum. And so when we follow blue yellow around his territory, we can make really beautiful maps like this. And so here at the star is where his nest was. And you can see that most of the foraging was kind of right around the nest. So the dark blue areas are the locations where he foraged in the most. And you can see that he used really directed foraging towards particular plant species. He foraged in black cherry and sweet gum and black walnut. And a lot of the neighborhood around him was really being avoided. And so really what were these chickadees avoiding? You're probably not surprised to learn that they were avoiding non-native plants. So we find that this again is the number of caterpillar species that a plant supports. And we see this really beautiful linear relationship in native plants, where the more caterpillars that a plant supports, the more that these chickadees are preferring them relative to their availability in the landscape. And non-native plants are less preferred, and that relationship is much weaker. So these plants are really just not supporting the same amount of foraging habitat for these chickadees. They're basically just kind of like little statues in the landscape that are being avoided. And again, just to reiterate, is that most of our non-native species are here on the lower end of the spectrum. They're unrelated to our native plants. They support no bird foraging, no caterpillars. But even our related non-native plants are not doing enough to support our birds. These were some of the trees that this is for Washington, D.C. So these numbers are probably different for Louisiana, like I shared, but these you can see that all the species that were highly preferred by chickadees were the ones that were supporting a lot of caterpillar species. So here are these plants again: oaks, maples, cherries, elms, and hickories. All really great plants, loved by our birds. And so what we offered is that in this paper, we offer that this number of caterpillar species that a plant supports could be a really nice proxy for how its quality from a bird's perspective. And so we actually have this information available for you. If you'd like to put in your zip code, you can visit the Native Plant Finder, which is a website through the National Wildlife Federation. You can find different native plants for your zip code. But then you can also get the number of caterpillar species that they support. And so, you know, everybody has different characteristics that shape what plants that they support. Maybe you need something small, maybe you need something for the shade, maybe you want something with pink flowers. But now you can also use this number of caterpillar species as a quantitative way to make relative comparisons among trees in terms of how well they support bird habitat. The other cool thing is that while we were studying these chickadees, it was spring migration in Washington, D.C. And so the same trees that my chickadees were foraging in were also covered in these beautiful array of migratory birds. And in fact, by the end of the study, we had documented more than 50 different species of migratory birds that were using residential yards during stopover, and over 20 different species of warblers. And we were documenting numerous declining insectivores and species of conservation concern. And so these are birds that don't necessarily breed in urban areas. They might not even breed in Washington, D.C., but they're traveling to the boreal forest, or they're going, you know, during fall migration, they're traveling down to the rainforests of South America. But along the way, they have to stop over to refuel. And during that time, they're stopping over in our urban and our suburban areas. And so, you know, whether these birds can find the trees that supply these insects for them to eat could really be life or death for these birds. You know, those 3 days that they spend in your yard could really be possibly the most important days of that bird's life. And so, you know, but we know that these birds are using these urban areas during migration. We don't know how they're doing. And so what the fellowship that I got recently through the Society of Conservation Biology is really to look at this question further, is to really understand for these birds that are using urban areas, how are they doing? Are they able to find food? This weird picture here next to the wood thrush, that's a little myrtle warbler with fat. That's what these birds really need to make their migratory journey. So we're going to be catching birds, doing surveys to really understand, are these birds able to find the food they need and be in good condition in order to migrate. Let's see. So this last little bit of my talk here, I'm going to be finishing up now. I really want to do a little bit of a thought experiment for you. So I'm going to ask you this question of how many caterpillars do you think it takes to make a nest of chickadees? So get a number in your head, think about it, and whatever number that you put in your head, the answer is probably wrong. But the answer is lots. It takes many, many, many caterpillars to feed just one nest of chickadees. And, you know, back in the day, there were ornithologists that had actually quantified that. And so Brewer in 1960 found that chickadees were bringing 390 to 570 caterpillars per day to feed a nest of chickadees. And so if you think about it, over the 16 days of a bird's nest, that's thousands and thousands and thousands of caterpillars just to raise one little nest of chickadees. Oh, here it is now. So 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to raise a nest of one 10-gram bird. So just 10 pennies in your hand is what a chickadee is. So think about how many caterpillars does it take to raise a cardinal or a woodpecker or a blue jay? It takes lots and lots. And so the other question that I had was really, are there consequences if non-native plants are abundant? And I'm gonna skip through this a little bit just because I think I'm running out of time here. You know, we really wanted to understand here, if these birds are forced to be in an area with a lot of non-native plants, does that have any effect on the population? And in order to quantify that, we need to collect a lot of data, right? So we have to collect information about the reproduction of those birds. We have to collect data on their survival, their juvenile survival. So once those baby birds leave the nest, how well do they survive to reach independence? And we can plug all of that different information together and we can get at population growth for that chickadee. And so what we found, with the help of all these householders who helped us monitor these birds, we found that as non-native plants increase, reproduction strongly declines. And we actually found negative effects on reproduction at different stages of the nesting cycle. So these birds avoided places with non-native plants. They also, if they nested there, they were laying fewer eggs. If they laid eggs, they were less likely to have a nest that was surviving, or they were fledging fewer young. And it turns out that most of those effects are fairly modest, but when you compound them all together over the course of the whole nest, it makes a much more drastic decline in reproduction. And we didn't find any real effective survival. And so it really is that food limitation, at least for this species, is happening when their foraging area is most constrained, when they're feeding those vulnerable baby birds in the nest. What we did find during, while we were following our birds around while they were feeding juveniles that had left the nest, is that it takes a whole neighborhood to raise a chickadee. So this little circle is the area around their territory that we were monitoring, and they were going up to 1 kilometer away after the birds had fledged in order to find those really productive plants. And it turns, once they go out in the neighborhood, they're like, oh, I'm just going to go to oaks. I'm just going to go to elms because I have nothing restraining me. I can go anywhere I want. And then they go to some really weird places like the gas station. So here I am at Sunoco with my binoculars, looking up into the trees, and they're like, are you here to fix the electric, or are you here to fix the pumps? And I'm like, oh, no, I'm here for my chickadees. They really like your willow oaks. So they can, they're really using a real diversity of different land uses in these landscapes. And so, the last thing that I want to show you here is really when we have all that information, we can then plug that into a population growth model to understand, are these populations sustainable? If they have this huge decline in reproduction, are they able to produce enough young to sustain the local population? So here at the dashed line is replacement. So if a bird has a positive value, that means they're producing more young than the ones that die. If they have a negative value, they're more birds are dying than the ones that are being produced. And so you would expect that a stable population would fluctuate around the middle, right around 0. And so what we see really is that as non-native plants increase, that population growth strongly declines. And we see that our mean population growth, this line here in the middle, is at 10% non-native plants. But we are scientists, and we recognize that we just took 3 models when we plug them into one model. So we need to really be transparent about, some of the variation that's there. And so we see that the point at which there's no chance really at all, or a very, very minimal chance that these birds are producing enough young to sustain the local population, is at 30%. So at 30% non-native plants, once you get past that, it's just a negligible probability. And so we offer that 30% then as a threshold that people can then aim for if they want to create habitat for birds. If you have less than 30% non-native plants, there's at least some chance for these birds to produce enough young to sustain a local population. The good thing is that in DC, our average was just 50%. So really, if you think about it, asking people to aim for 30 is just kind of a gentle nudge. in the right direction towards creating landscapes that are better for bird habitat. But, you know, we've done a lot of work in commercial areas, in some new developments, and we find that in some of these places that non-native plants can be 80 to 90% of the non-native plant biomass that's out there. And so if we really want to improve these areas for bird habitat, that's going to require a much more drastic change in our landscaping practices in order to create habitats that are producing enough food to have sustainable populations for chickadees. And of course, for our more sensitive insectivores, like our migratory birds, we're going to have to aim a little lower. But this is at least a starting point. And it's a number that people can then use. So just to, you know, give you some take-home messages, because I know I threw a lot of information at you today. You know, my take-home message is really that plants vary in the contributions that they have towards species interactions. And that native plants tend to support more species interactions, and our birds and insects tend to prefer these native plants. But there's also some plants that are very productive even within native plants, and we should be prioritizing them in our landscapes. And then the last point here is really that if we landscape with native plants, we can then improve habitat for our insectivorous bird populations, and that we offer that this 30% non-native plant biomass is a threshold that you could aim for in order to create better habitat and to support sustainable bird populations. So that's basically all that I have for you today. I hope that you learned something. I hope that you got some information that you can then use. And I hope that I have conveyed to you today just that including native plants are important, but not just that native plants are important, but that your yards matter. And that those simple choices that you make in your landscaping can really have cascading impacts for ecological function. And so with that, I urge you to explore your gardens, go out, find out what's there, learn about the critters that are using it, and then start thinking about what kind of changes that you might make in order to create more habitat at home. It's a really fun activity, and it's a great way to support conservation in your own property. And so with that, I'm just going to skip through and just say thank you to all of the landowners and the field techs and the volunteers that participated in this project that I shared with you today, because without their help, none of this would be possible. And then thank you so much for your time and for listening. And if you want to find any of these papers, if you want to get any more information, you can visit my website. You can also, you can email me, or you can find me on Twitter, #PlantsForWildlife. So thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful, thank you. That was tons of information and really enjoyable to listen to. Plus your energy and your excitement over all of it is inspirational as well.
No, thanks.
So we're right at 8 o'clock according to my clock, but and normally we cut off around then. There's nothing making me shut it down right now. So if there are any questions, then people can still put them in the chat and I can read them out loud. So far, we just have people praising you and saying, thank you, beautiful presentation, beautiful photos. Colette did make the comment that hopefully we can convince more of our local nurseries to offer more native plants because they can still be so hard to find.
Oh, absolutely.
So continuing to host presentations like this and increase demand and at least let our local nurseries and growers know that the demand is out there, and it's outpacing supply right now. Catherine is asking if Doug Tallamy is a mentor, and
oh yes, Doug was my advisor, and he is an ongoing mentor in my life. We have lots of different projects together. So that Keystone Plant Project is a new paper from him and I, and Yeah, so he's also inspired how I think about conservation too.
And Doug has presented not too long ago in Baton Rouge for a different native plant.
Oh, awesome.
Pre-COVID, when he was able to come here in person. Jane was asking, how is your biomass measured realistically?
Oh, sure. So, so the way that we measure, so when we were collecting our plant information, we went out and used very fine scale measurements on the diameter of the trunks of the trees, as well as measuring the foliage volume of the canopies of the trees, the foliage volume of the shrubs. And we were using a protocol by the U.S. Forest Service called the iTree protocol. And we were able to use that information to then calculate importance values of trees and shrubs, which is a forestry measurement. And so that's how we're able to quantify dominance, not just of native and non-native, but also every plant species that we had within our plots. And iTree is something that anyone can use. It's, you can use, there's a program, you can Google it. A lot of restoration groups and urban forestry folks are using iTree to quantify their plant communities. It's not super user friendly, and my fellowship right now is with the Forest Service, and that's one of the conversations that we're having is how can we create a tool that I can then give you a link so that you can do the same thing in your yard, so that you can, assess whether you're reaching the goals that you're aiming for.
I have a lot of lawn, but I also have large willow oaks, magnolia, sweetback magnolia, red bay, different things in my yard.
Oh, nice.
I just don't know how to analyze whether or not I'm hitting that 70% level, so
yeah,
because I do have a lot of lawn, so I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah. So one of the questions that so the other thing too is to keep in mind is that this is at the territory scale of the bird. So it's really not just one yard, it's the neighboring yards as well. But if you calculate out this minimum biomass that birds would need to be sustainable, it turns out to be about 2 mature large, like 100 DBH trees, or so DBH is like diameter trees. So think about 2 large mature trees, 5 medium to large size trees, 10 smallish trees like a dogwood, or like 25 small saplings for an individual parcel. If every yard around you also did that, that's basically hitting the mark.
That's very cool.
Those are natives.
Very cool.
I should put that slide in the future.
Yeah, that also means though that these neighborhoods that are where they come in and they remove everything, they raise it to the dirt, and then they plant houses with 0 lots, and then they put in crepe myrtles and sago palms, basically and lawn are a desert. I mean, they're just a desert.
Yeah. And we had some information, or we did another study that, so chickadees breed really early, but cardinals will breed into like September and things. So we did another study with a bunch of birds later into the season, and the differences between native and non-native get even more drastic as you get later in the season. Where there were sites that we were going to where we would do all of our sampling, which takes hours, and not get a single caterpillar. We'd get like 2 spiders. And it was an incredible food desert in some of these areas.
Donna added kind of on that note in a comment that I think about all the time, but can ornithologists work with other professionals like landscape architects, like developers and contractors to educate them on the importance of native plants to healthy ecosystems, noting that we just need more voices promoting natives and relative to even school programs. I know when I was studying in natural resource ecology at the same time that I had friends in landscape architecture who were studying non-native ornamentals, that I just wish that they still took at least one of our native plant ecology, taxonomy courses. So I don't know if you have a feel for that changing at universities and any of the education programs.
Yeah, so I love that question because then I can share a little bit. So some folks contact me all the time, asking me to consult on different projects or to ask questions. Actually, after our population study came out, I was contacted by some landscape designers who were putting forward a proposal because Washington D.C. is completely completely fixing their street tree canopy because they're trying to reach a 40% tree canopy for the city. And they were putting in a proposal and they said, this is great. You gave us numbers. We can put those numbers in our proposal and use that. Like, will you help us do that? And so, yeah, so I try to make myself available to anyone that wants to use this. I give talks all the time. Unfortunately, I'm just one person. So, so I try to, make as much as I can available so that people like, you all can then talk to people and convince them that, that this is doable and we can offer some suggestions. And to really, demand that we have native plants at Home Depot, that our street trees are, there's no reason that they need to be non-native. They can be native trees that can survive in urban ecosystems. And the last point that I just want to make is that ecologists, and I'm trying to do this more, need to interact with horticulturists more so that, because there's always going to be values that people have. They want something pretty, they want something easy. So the more that we work with the people that are actually cultivating the plants, we can create plants that people can then use. So Mount Cuba in Delaware is a really great, or Pennsylvania, is a really great example because they realize that, not everybody can plant an oak tree, but they're starting to make, for example, dwarf varieties that people can then use in their landscaping to kind of, make it more doable for a larger public.
Jane, this kind of reminds me, didn't you used to say something about business in the front, party in the back, like a mullet? You have an HOA and you can think of your yard like that.
Messy in the back.
Right. Oh yeah. That's a thing, the mullet hypothesis. We definitely saw that in yards. We'd go into backyards and we were like, whoa. Here.
Awesome. Like you said, you are only one person, so thank you so much for being open to us recording this. So if anybody is listening and needs to refer back to, or if we could use your presentation in classrooms or wherever it's appropriate, it'll be available. And
just share it with gardeners everywhere.
Yeah. And the thing is we need more information about what native plants are available and where we can get them. And so if you go into a nursery and they don't have what you're looking for, like, raise hell, tell them, like, I was looking for this and you didn't have it. I would have spent my money, but now I'm not. And that'll get them to change their tune.
Completely agree. And we are trying to keep track of local nurseries that are selling natives so that we can have them posted on Audubon websites and others who are also helping to promote the that whole push right now. Okay, well, it's 10 after. I don't want to keep you too late. I don't have any more questions in the chat, and I was just curious really quickly, when you were presenting earlier, and thank you for subbing in slides for Louisiana specifically on which species host the largest number of moths and butterflies. Is that, since you pulled that from somewhere, is that already publicly accessible?
Yes. So this is a database that we put together that's based on historical records of plant caterpillar associations. And we also integrated that with plant distributions for Louisiana. The data can be accessed on that National Wildlife Federation website. That website is in beta mode though. So, take it with a grain of salt. We're working on it to make it better. The other thing is in the paper, and I can share that with you. It's actually open access, so anybody can access it. In our supplemental data, we have all the numbers for every county that we studied. Although now that I think of it, actually, I had to ask my colleague for Louisiana specifically because that's not in the paper. But we're working on it. We're working on getting this information out there so that it'll be available for everyone to use. And we do have this for every state, I believe, at this point.
Okay, well, cool. I will be on the lookout for that.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for listening. And
I have a list from Dr. Allen of all the species for our state and for each butterfly and moth they host, if you want me to pass it along as well.
Yeah, that would be
oh,
wonderful.
that's awesome.
Catherine.
Okay.
Yeah, I do know we've had some local efforts on tracking some of those as well, which has been.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is too, is that the database that we have is just, can this caterpillar use a plant? So this colleague of yours might have more fine scale information for Louisiana, because like I said, some caterpillars can be regionally specialized too. So
Which was very interesting. I didn't realize quite how pronounced that could be.
Mhm. Great.
All right, Dr. Narango, just
Well,
additional praise and thanks from people that were in attendance.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and for listening, and good luck everyone with your landscaping.
Okay, well, hopefully we can have you back for the next edition at some point in the future.
Wonderful.
All right, have a good night, everybody.
Bye everyone.